Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this discussion of Emily Bitto's new book, Wild Abandon. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of which I'm currently on in Meanjin, which is the Yuggera and Turrbal people, as well as the traditional owners of the land which are all joining us from on Zoom tonight across the country. I pay my respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Everyone in our audience, you will be on mute for the session, but you're welcome to have your video on. If you have any questions, please just type them to me in the chat box. And just make sure your view is set to speaker view. That way you'll be able to see Emily and Krissy in full screen. Once I wrap up my little spiel here, I will also send you through a link in the chat box of where you can purchase Wild Abandon. And this will also show you how to use the chat function, which will be very important for our Q&A that we'll have at about 7:15 or 7:20, just seeing how we go for time. But please feel free to type your questions throughout the event as they pop into your head, and then I'll pass them along to Emily towards the end. That's all from me. I'd love to introduce you to our conversation partner for tonight, Krissy Kneen. Krissy is the author of 8 works of fiction, memoir, and poetry, including the Thomas Shapcott award-winning Eating My Grandmother and the Stella Prize shortlisted An Uncertain Grace. Her latest book is the memoir, The Three Burials of Lottie Kneen. Over to you, Krissy.
Thanks, Yana. Thanks so much. I'm very, very excited to be hosting this event tonight because this book by Emily, Wild Abandon, is an incredible joy to read. So if you have been an avid reader in the last couple of weeks, you will have seen me raving about this book. Occasionally I will find a book that really connects with me, and I will be placing it in everybody's hands. And this has been the book that I'm doing that most with at the moment. So congratulations, Emily. I totally enjoyed this book just quietly at the front of this event. So we have Emily Bitto here with us, who is a Melbourne-based writer of fiction, poetry, and non-fiction. She has a master's in literary studies and a PhD in creative writing from the University of Melbourne. Her debut novel, The Strays, was the winner of the 2015 Stella Prize. In 2018, she was awarded a 6-month Australia Council International Residency in Rome, very jealous, to work on her second novel and debut poetry collection. She's been teaching creative writing for over a decade and is currently a tutor at the Faber Writing Academy, and is also the co-owner of the Carlton Wine Bar, Heart Attack and Vine, which is one of my places that I love to go to whenever I'm in Melbourne. So welcome, Emily.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's great to be here with you. This is book 2, really, for you. So they always talk about the difficult second novel. Did you find that this was the difficult second novel when you were actually in the process of writing this book?
Yeah, I did struggle with this book. I think partly, there was a few things, partly because we opened the bar 6 months after The Strays was published. So I had about 2 years where I really didn't get to write anything. I was just pouring wines and working, 70 hours a week behind the bar. And then I think, probably winning the Stella Prize did put a little bit of pressure on me. I think once I sort of realised I was probably not the kind of writer that's going to put out a book a year, and I'm more the one every 5 years kind of writer, that made me feel a bit better. But also I think the thing that really shocked me, to be honest, was how I thought, after writing a book that it would be easier to write the next one, and it was no easier to write the second one. And so when I started, I just was like, I haven't learned anything. I'm just right back at the start again. So that was a rude awakening.
I wonder what was that kernel. I was talking to Charlotte Wood about Luminous Solutions, her new book about writing, last week, and she was talking about the heat, that thing that hooks you into an idea that makes you last the distance with a book. What was the heat in this book? What was that original kernel of an idea that you couldn't let go when you decided to write this book?
That's a really good question. I mean, probably the initial kind of inspiration was this news story that I read that loosely inspired the kind of second part of the book, which I won't give away too much, but that kind of just it stuck in my mind, and I knew that I had to write about it. But also I think probably the main thing for me was just I had this real drive to write a kind of contemporary book. You know, The Strays was a historical novel, and I just wanted to sort of write a book that felt to me like it was playing out the process of just thinking about the strange time that we're living in. You know, this sort of, you know, maybe this makes me sound pessimistic, but to me it feels like a bit of a Rome before the fall moment.
I think we might all be feeling a little bit like that at the moment, to be honest, and probably not quite as much when you started writing this book.
Yeah.
When did you actually start writing this book?
So probably in late 2016, early 2017, I really properly got into it. I got some funding to go to the States to do some research for it. And that was at the end of 2016. So yeah, I had like a good 2 years of not doing any writing after The Strays came out, and then just started dabbling in the research. But, you know, I actually wrote probably 50,000 words of this book in Rome in 2018, you know, when I finally kind of got to leave the country and leave the bar for a while.
Yeah. So the main character of this book, Will, which I have to admit I once called someone Will in a manuscript and regretted it, because if you're searching for the name, you get all the Wills that are not a name when you search for
yes.
it. And if you want to change the name to something else, then it's this massive job of feeding out the wills, and then you get will do this, which is very strange. Anyway, I'm sure you came across all these issues with the name Will. But Will leaves Melbourne and he arrives in New York, and right from the very first page of the book, he's out looking for drugs. And he's not a big drug taker, but he's out hunting for some drugs to take. There's almost this sense of, you know, things are not necessarily going to be all roses from the very first page when he's out looking for drugs in New York. This sense of anxiety, I think, that you kind of you drive the reader forward. It's a page turner of a book, and there's this kind of constant sense of anxiety. And I wonder whether that was, as you're talking about the contemporary moment and our contemporary moment, and it really made me think we are living in a time when people are just anxious all the time. And I wonder whether this was an actual conscious thing for you to put us in the deep end and then get us deeper and deeper as you went through.
Yeah, it was. And I think, you know, in Will's case, you know, him as a character, he's just had his heart broken, and he's basically sort of doing that thing that probably we all have done, where we're just looking for any escape from our feelings. But I guess looking at him in more of a metaphorical sense, what I wanted to kind of create is this energy of just rushing forward, refusing to kind of look back, to think about what, you know, the kind of inevitable crash, whether that's, you know, literal or kind of metaphorical, you know, this kind of feeling of just rushing forward, just like give me more to kind of distract from that.
Right, yeah. And I mean, he does that for a little while, but I absolutely love this page here. I don't know if anyone can see this, but it's a, you know, this Will has been avoiding thinking about Laura, who he's broken up with, by taking drugs and immersing himself in New York. And you just know that there are little flashes of Laura about to crack through, and then he kind of loses it, and you get this page and a half of Laura. And I really felt that, you know, as soon as I got to that, I laughed out loud, and it was like, yep, that's exactly what it feels like when you're trying to avoid something for so long. When it comes, that's all there is. You don't even need to talk about it. It's just that name. So that was a beautiful little flourish, I think, at the beginning there. But to go back to his time in New York, he arrives in New York, and Paul is the first person who takes him in, and Paul is a friend from back home. And there's this sense, and what I love that you do is you have this sense we're in this new place, we're in New York, we're in a place that's very much not like where he's come from, and yet there's this person who knows who he is. There's Paul, who's from his childhood and almost a big brother character. And I wonder what you were doing. Well, it's very clear what you were doing with Paul, but I wonder if you can talk a little bit about including that voice from home, that person who knows who he is.
Yeah. So I guess, Will is, when you kind of go on those first overseas trips, and probably a big part of the appeal, as well as just seeing new places and experiencing new cultures, is that ability to try out, new ways of being, with this feeling that no one knows you, that you're not being watched. But Paul sort of represents for Will actually that very feeling of kind of being watched with a sort of malignant eye, because Paul was really kind of bullying to him when he was young. And, he basically is forced to stay with Paul because he's got no money. So he kind of has to be there. But Paul's, the thorn in his side in that sense, because he's constantly reminded by Paul's presence of who he was, the fact that he feels not good enough, that, Paul is probably still judging him, that he's a country boy at heart. But then I think as he sort of sees Paul as well and spends more time with him, he starts to think, oh, maybe Paul actually represents something that I could aspire to, because Paul's been living in New York for 7 years. He's become like this successful chef. He seems like to Will that he's completely thrown off this, country boy uncoolness, and has become the epitome of the kind of cool New York expat. So, that's sort of a positive and a negative, I guess, for Will as well. So yeah, he's definitely an antagonist, Paul.
He definitely is. And he's also, there's also a sense that, and I think that that's something that Australians often feel too, like Australia as a culture has this kind of chip on its shoulder in a way internationally. There seems to be a sense that we are a smaller town compared to other kind of international cities. And I really felt like this sense that even though, Paul has been there for 7 years, he still hasn't shaken off the idea that he is from a small place and doesn't quite have the sophistication that all the friends that he's made have as well. So there was something about the Australian identity that was really strong in that New York section. And also you didn't need to, when you read the book, you don't really need to start in New York. That's not it's not an essential for the book to start in New York. And yet it gives you all these nuances that if you missed the New York section, you wouldn't get otherwise. Is that something that you thought of? I'm kind of wondering what your decision was to have that whole first third of the book, I think it is, set in New York, when potentially it could have just been cut.
Yeah, I guess, I wanted, like, as I said, the first idea was the second third, 2/3 of the book, which is set in Ohio. But as I sort of developed the story and, knew that I had to kind of have this Australian character, because I couldn't, tell a sort of American story from the inside, I guess I became more and more interested in the relationship between Australia and America as the sort of new cultural centre in my mind, that sort of replaced, definitely replaced the UK, and also, I guess, the idea of travel itself. And so New York is such a sort of beacon of cool, and the place that so many people dream of traveling to. So to kind of really play with that idea of the sort of fantasy of travel, it just kind of fit. And then I guess I've got these two sections that both of them I've called America. So it's sort of playing with that idea of there are two Americas here, but there would be infinite Americas, really. These are just two, but they're so different. And, you can't really ever kind of get a proper sense of a place. I was thinking about people coming to Australia, and recently watched that film. Have you seen Hotel Coolgardie, I think it's called, about these poor Scandinavian backpackers who come and work in this pub in a mining town? And I was just thinking about what their idea of Australia is, just going to one kind of place. And if Will had just gone to Ohio, it would have been a very different experience. And so I guess it ties into those ideas about that very idea of travel and the fantasy of the place you're going to versus the reality.
It works beautifully. I just love the New York stuff. I love the fact that you seem to know a couple of those worlds really intimately. Now you've got that that hospitality background. So every time Paul works in hospitality, and so there's this really clear sense that we have of the world of hospitality, both back home in Melbourne and also in New York. But there's also this other world, which is the art world, which it's interesting that you explored the same sort of world in Australia in The Strays, and really kind of delved into the art world. And I wonder if you have those connections personally, if that's why you're drawn to the art world.
I mean, my aunt and uncle are both artists, so I guess I've sort of grown up around art all my life. But I think obviously there's that definite connection between the two, but they sort of, for me, they were quite different. They came out of different things for me. With The Strays, I think I was really interested in the idea of a group of people that sort of wanted to create a utopian community. And I think in the early stages of that wasn't necessarily going to be the art world. I was kind of thinking it could have been a hippie commune or something like that. It grew into that, and I definitely have that fascination with the art world. But that was the reason for wanting to set it in that world in The Strays. And then here, I think it kind of grew out of just thinking about all of the weird sort of different subcultures and the kind of niche cultures that exist in this world of incredible sort of hyper capitalism that we live in. And I did all this sort of brainstorming early on about what are the images and ideas that sort of resonate with me, that epitomize that those ideas. And I think the art world is so much the apex of that. It's so specific, so it works in such weird ways. And then again, the kind of world of hospitality and food culture also seemed like it does that same sort of thing.
The art stuff particularly, it's all about money. There's so much money in that world, which is really part of the anxiety of that first part of the book, because we know that Will's bank account is just being drained day by day as he tries to keep up with these people who can take drugs and drink cocktails all the time and eat really expensive food. But this kind of the pinnacle of that is Marcus, who's this really interesting character that you have drawn in that first section. Can you talk a little bit about Marcus and who he is and where the idea of him came from? Because he really epitomizes that well for me.
Yeah, I don't know where Marcus came from. He just sort of popped up in my imagination, but he is he's the gallery owner that Paul's girlfriend's art show is at his gallery. And there's a few points in the book where am I breaking up?
No, yes, you said you're okay at the moment.
Cool. Yeah, I think in the process of just writing my way into this story, I just started playing around with Marcus, and I wrote this little section from his perspective. So he's he's an older man. He's been living in New York for many, many years. He's incredibly sort of successful in his field, and he meets Will. And I wrote this little tiny sort of snippet where we suddenly see Will through his eyes. And that became something that I decided to use at other points in the narrative as well. I call them swivels for myself.
Mm-hmm.
But it was really fun sort of inhabiting his mind just for a moment. He's the kind of opposite of Will. Will is so sort of open and excited and just wants to be awed by everything. And Marcus is kind of incredibly jaded and bored with everything.
It's a wonderful character, and the party at Marcus's place is a wonderful kind of climax for that first part of the book. I really love the fact that, I think we might have lost Emily.
I think I'm back.
Are you back?
I got kicked out for a second, but
you're back on. That's great. That's good. We're here. So I think that with that art world stuff, there's some wonderful foreshadowing. Darla, one of the artists, is about to go and do a project where she goes and looks at masculinity and wolves and sort of men, soldiers who go and work with wolves. And this is a wonderful foreshadowing for the part that's coming next. Is this an actual project that you came across?
Not the art project, but that the project with veterans who have PTSD, who actually do get to spend time with wolves, is a real program, which just, it's so fascinating. I just read about that as I was writing this, and I just thought that has to go in there.
Wow, it's fantastic. And also the idea that Darla, as this female artist, is going to actually go into this place where it's all about masculinity and men and wolves, kind of reminded me that you are a female writer who is really writing a story that's ultimately about masculinity and a kind of almost coming of self or coming of age story for a young man. And I wonder whether Darla was you, I suppose, in this book, a little sneaky version of Emily.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but
I think she might be. But she's foreshadowing, of course, the next bit, which is where ultimately Will is going to run out of money. We know this from page 1, really, when he's out looking for drugs with hardly any money left in his bank account. And we know that he's going to have to leave New York because it is way too expensive. I won't spoil the New York section by telling you the real reason why he leaves, but I'll also but he does have to leave, and he ends up in Ohio in a little town called Little Proud. And really interestingly, you have used the same device, I suppose we could call it, of having a person from home, a person that knows Will. So Tamzin is a heavily pregnant young woman who he went to school with, who he didn't necessarily, and who also had a lot to do with his family. Can you talk a little bit about Tamzin's role in the next section?
Yeah, so I think Tamzin is kind of very different from Paul. She, if Paul and Will are both kind of trying to basically throw off their small town origins, and Paul has kind of supposedly succeeded in doing that by going to New York and throwing himself into that world, Tamzin is very kind of happy with her identity as a country girl. She doesn't feel it as something that reflects badly on her. And so again, this is sort of something that's a bit of a thorn in Will's side, because she's kind of reminding him of, everything that he doesn't want to be, but then also she's so comfortable with it, and she, kind of sees him trying so hard to be someone else. And I think, you know, he probably picks up on that as well. So, you know, again, I just wanted to kind of have these things that remind the reader about Will's kind of origins and, you know, that kind of tension between, you know, the town and the city, the, you know, Australia versus the world, that feeling of kind of lacking culture and lacking, you know, cool or whatever it is that Will is seeking ultimately.
It's a wonderful way of kind of a foil to him to have these people from home, I think. And also you called them Swivels, did you? Where you kind of, it's really, I was going to ask you about that because it's mostly this third person focused viewpoint where we're focused on Will in the third person. And yet occasionally at very opportune moments, we see him. We have this kind of little mirror which kind of reflects him with somebody else's opinion of him, which gives the women in this book a lot of agency, I felt. So even though this book is very much about masculinity and about Will and a man, there's the women in it have such rounded characters, and part of it is these swivels that you do. And I wonder whether you were at all thinking about gender when you were writing this book. And about how those women are represented in the book.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I obviously knew that it was going to be dominated by male characters, so I did put a lot of thought into how I could make those, you know, women who are inevitably kind of on the sidelines to a certain extent, how I could make them have, you know, voice and agency. And I think the Swivels partly kind of come into that. And also, you know, dialogue as well. There's a lot of dialogue in the book, and that's, I guess, another way that the women can kind of have a voice. Some of the time they're saying things that Will really doesn't want to hear.
They really keep him honest in some points of this book, I think.
Yeah.
And they seem to be the ones who have this clear sight when Will is completely oblivious sometimes to his own behaviour, which is excellent. I loved the women in this book, and I felt like it was equally their story as it was Will's as well. We're in this small town, so Will's run out of money and he has to get a job, and he meets up with Wayne Gage, and this is someone who is going to give him a job at a private zoo that Wayne has. And this is really where the book takes a crazy turn that really compels you towards the end. I just wonder if you can give us a little glimpse of this with a reading from the book, because, you know, I was knocked off my feet when I met Wayne and the animals that Wayne owns. So could I get you to read from the book?
Of course. This is my first proper reading from the book, so I'm slightly nervous, but hopefully you'll enjoy it. So this is basically Will's first visit to the private zoo. He hasn't started working there yet, and it's his first encounter with these wild animals that Wayne has a lot of, as a lot of people in America actually do, believe it or not. And then the blunted day honed itself to a point, for at the rows of cages set along the flank of the driveway, Will stood before living predators of enormous size and physical power, creatures that once again set off some deep dwelling response of recognition and fear and ambivalent euphoria, some reawakened blink of the sleeping senses in an animal who has long forgotten what it is to be prey. Warm, thrumming human meat that contains within its dormant species destiny the potential and even lust to be taken and absorbed into and merged with the material being of these dream exquisite beasts. And as the creatures caught sight or scent of Wayne with his barrow, a fearful roaring broke out and spread, gathering resonance as it multiplied like bass feedback, until Will could feel it in his feet and in his chest, as if his own heart was vibrating, whether in fear or sympathy or reverence, he would not have been able to guess, for in this uncharted zone of experience, he was able only to observe his own animal responses and extrapolate from them some new set of facts about what kind of man he was or might become. At the cages, the smell intensified, the men's urinal in an Aussie pub to the power of 1,000. Wayne set down the barrow by the first cage, which held a frankly humongous white tiger, prone and impassive, its death-commanding paws lined up in prim parallel and its body curved so that the long, close striped tail wrapped around to lie beside a front leg. "This is Snow," said Wayne. I'm not going to do the American accent. He's a white Siberian tiger, weighs in at almost 600 pounds. JT glanced at Will, who was standing back, the deer leg hanging against his calf. Will felt it drip from its hacked end into his boot. "You look like you might be wigging out a little," JT said. Will laughed, tried to make the laugh full of ease. "I kind of think I might be. It's pretty wild." Wayne smiled at him. "When you actually get to know each and every one of them and see that they all have their own personalities, it's the most incredible thing in the world." The tiger was so close to the bars that Will could hear its huffing out breaths and discern each long white whisker sprouting from the pink muzzle cheeks each side of his plump nose. He lifted his gigantic head and opened his mouth, revealing curved canine incisors that looked like they could punch straight through Will's skull. And then the tiger stood and leapt up sudden and full height, his tufted paws pressing the bars. The three grown men reached barely to his chest. He nuzzled his head against the wire, and Wayne put his hand through and sunk it to the wrist in the deep white shag of the tiger's fur. Will stopped breathing. He couldn't help it. His hands were shaking. This was crazy. The word majestic came into his mind, but he was immediately embarrassed by the cliche and struck by the utter inadequacy of language to represent this creature, this experience. He remembered the theory of the sublime, which he'd read in philosophy class, and thought that this was what it meant, the zoomed out microscopic self, the protective carapace of culture rupturing and falling away. He rebuked himself for retreating into theory, undoubtedly a protective mechanism in the face of that which he could not assimilate. And there he went again, when he should be simply and profoundly looking, encountering this animal being and remembering that he was an animal himself. Fuck, no wonder he had no girlfriend. He was so far inside his own head that the sight of a tiger had sent him into some kind of existential crisis.
Oh, that's fantastic. You totally feel those animals. Those animals are so present on the page. And part of that is actually this prose that you write in, which is kind of almost biblical in a way. It felt like, I think you, in your in the credits at the end, you thank your editor for allowing you to keep your Baroque sentences. And these Baroque sentences feel a bit like, you know, they feel like Cormac McCarthy. They feel like this giant blood meridian, if you've ever read that, biblical world, which makes everything so huge. Was this style, it's very different from the Strays. Was this a style that came from your research? How did you end up writing in this style?
I guess a couple of things. There's part of it was a desire to sort of, I guess, evoke a tradition of a sort of quest narrative. You know, I became really interested in that idea of the kind of masculine quest, which, you know, is as old as narrative itself. And, you know, it's this young man setting out into the world to find his fortune. And I wanted to kind of evoke that and the sort of seductions of that narrative while also sort of gently critiquing it. And then also, I guess I wanted to try and kind of mirror with the language this sense of the kind of, you know, that aspect of the contemporary that I mentioned before about the, you know, the excess and the sort of feeling of just too muchness. So I wanted the prose to sort of do that at times as well, to kind of give the reader almost a sense of over over excess, and then to sort of temper that again with, you know, things like the dialogue, which is, you know, in a completely different register. So it was, you know, it was really fun having those different sort of styles mashing up against each other.
It certainly works to give us this sense that this world is bigger than Will, that he's just this small kind of person in this giant, the giant animals, the giant personality of Wayne Gage, the giant personality of America.
Yeah.
It gives us this real sense. And it's all there in those words on the page, in those sentences which curl around each other the whole way through, which is wonderful. So thank you for bringing us. So often we see books that aim towards this kind of minimalism. Have you noticed that books are kind of truncating everything, that we almost don't say anything in a book these days?
Yeah, I definitely have, and particularly teaching creative writing, I think I've noticed that as, you know, almost the way that students are sort of taught or encouraged to write, which I think can be really good when you're starting out. But, you know, I like a lot of writers that write in a bit more of a elaborate style. And I think, you know, you may as well use the breadth of the language that everything it has to offer.
For sure. And of course, I think it's impossible to read this book now without remembering that Tiger King, the TV series, just took over everybody's imagination at the beginning of COVID. But you were writing this book way before Tiger King came to TV. You feel like suddenly you're there.
Yeah, I did have a moment of utter panic when I saw that show. I was like, it's taken my topic. But, you know, I think it paved the way for people to understand the context of that world. So, you know, and it was interesting, you know, it's even things like the fact that I started this book in the Obama era, and then when Trump came in, I also had a sort of panic of like, is this going to be relevant anymore? But, you know, I think books are always going to change, you know, in terms of the context that they're in, and once they're out in the world, you can't stop that anyway. So I just sort of decided to write on through all those things.
Well, there are certainly themes that will survive, you know, any new election of a president or any new change. So there, you've got things that you look at, like class differences, I think is something that's really strong in this book, as well as it was in The Strays as well. And I think that must be a preoccupation of yours, that you've used that in.
Yeah, I think so. I feel like it doesn't get enough of a look in, to be honest, in a lot of literature. So
we pretend that we have a classless society in Australia sometimes, and so this book really kind of underlines class difference within Australia as well, because Will's got a chip on his shoulder about his Melbourne friends who are just way cooler than he is as a country boy as well. And it's just amplified in America.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, I've got the frog in my throat.
And also, you have used true stories in both the books that you. So you've based. There's a kernel of truth in both of those books. Is that something that you now you're going to find a real life incident to kind of lead you through the books, or is it just this book?
Yeah, I don't know actually. Sorry. A lozenge. Yeah, it's obviously something that helps me find a way in. And thinking about the next kind of book that I'm just starting to research, there's definitely an element of it as well. So maybe that is my MO.
Yeah, well, it works. It's really great. And I love that you've found this story, because it I hadn't actually heard the original material for this book, the original news story that hooked you with. But I certainly felt it coming as soon as I went to Little Proud Ohio and found the zoo. I kind of could sense what was about to hit us. I think that's something about this book is it really shows itself and you have this sense of a looming and with it, which is great. Do you know if the American have had a chance to look at the book yet?
Not so far. Yeah, I think I kind of get the feeling that maybe it's not going to appeal to Americans. I don't know that they necessarily want Australians writing about their their culture in a way that you could probably interpret as somewhat critical.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see their take on it because it's very much through that Australian perspective.
Yeah.
But it's very much about America in a way too. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see. I'm going to open up to questions in a few minutes from the audience. So if anyone has any questions, please make sure that you type them into the chat bar and we'll get onto that as soon as possible. But I thought that before we got there, I'd like to talk about you writing in Rome. So the research, you actually went to America. Did you know when you were going to set the book when you went there?
Yeah, so it was after I'd read that news story, and I did go to the town in Ohio where the thing happened that I will not explain. And I got to, just spend time there, sort of soak up the atmosphere, and also visit. I went, say, to an animal sanctuary that had a lot of those exotic animals that had been surrendered or rescued from private zoos. That was pretty fascinating. I got to kind of be up close and personal with some tigers and lions. And I also did spend time in New York as well. Yeah, so that was amazing, just getting to actually go and be in the place and pretend to be Will, though I did not have as wild a time as Will in
quite many jokes. No, well, but then you said most of the writing or a bulk of the writing happened in Rome at that residency. How is it being somewhere else and writing about both Australia and America from Rome?
Actually, it's interesting. That's a really good question, because I think the thing that I really tuned into in Rome that I hadn't previously was the kind of Australian part of the story. So I don't think I had as much of Will's backstory and the sort of flashbacks. Sorry, I really got a funny throat tonight. Yeah, and I realised that I'd been so focused on America that I hadn't really put much of Australia into the book. And so maybe being out of Australia made me realise that, and I did a lot more thinking about Will's life, and I've just been given a glass of water. Yeah, so that's, I think it is really interesting that when you're in a new place, it makes you think so differently about the place that you come from.
Yeah. And the timing of this book, I mean, it's come out now while you're in lockdown, which is a bummer for lots of reasons. But did the pandemic impact on your writing or editing of this book in any way?
I did the main sort of structural edit through the long lockdown in Melbourne last year. And that was a very strange experience, actually. It really changed my ideas about writing, actually, because I think I've always had this fantasy of, if only all I had to do was write. And I kind of had that, I was just home all the time. The bar was closed, and I just had sort of day in, day out this time to do the edit, and it was awful. There was no sense of kind of potential to let it sit, go away and, see some friends, or even go and sit in a cafe. So it really did sort of shatter my fantasy of, the cloistered writer. And I will never have that fantasy again. I think it's important to have real life as a balance to the writing life.
And what about future writing? I mean, if you had been writing a contemporary fiction book now, would you feel that you needed to somehow weave what we're going through into the narrative? How do you feel about it now?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I've been teaching on Zoom for the last 2 years through the pandemic as well, and it's a question I've seen students really wrestle with, and I think, well, for me, I think like right now I wouldn't even know how to bring it in, because we still don't really know where we're going to go with COVID. I had students who were kind of coming up with ideas for novels, pandemic novels, right at the start, and I was like, maybe just wait and see how it unfolds a little bit before you do that. So I mean, it's a fascinating time, I think, for a writer just to be observing it, and it's going to be really interesting to see how people do incorporate this into books. You know how there was like that sort of massive sort of outpouring of September 11 novels. It will definitely, I'm sure, be the same. There'll be so many people trying to kind of come to grips with this time. But to be honest, I'm quite glad that I didn't have to incorporate it into this book.
Is your next book contemporary, or is it going to, are you writing a fiction, or are you still working on poetry?
I've got the sort of just the very starting seeds of a book, of fiction, a novel, but it's not contemporary. It's kind of more like the 60s, 70s. So going back in time again.
Dodge that bullet.
Yeah. What about you? Are you thinking about?
Yeah, I'm asking everybody these questions because I'm still looking at how to move forward with a contemporary fiction at this time. I think I'm going to lean right into it. I think I'm going to the heart of it, I think. And maybe that will be a book that will never be published because no one wants to read about the pandemic. But I think that's where I have to go.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to be the case at all. Like, writer's job is to reflect the world, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. We'll see where we go with it. Look, I think we should open up to questions from the audience now. If we have any, Jana, how are we going there?
Yes, we have had a few come in. So sorry, Emily, your voice will have to hold out for just a little longer. But I will start off with just a quick fire one. Rebecca wants to know if there's an audiobook in the works.
It is. In fact, I think it's already out. Should be accessible.
Great. BJ says, Emily has talked about the shift in the cultural focus of Australia from the UK to the US. How do you think this change in our orbit has changed our sense of ourselves and our literary culture?
Oh, that's a very good question. I don't necessarily know the answer to that. I mean, I think our relationship with, England is obviously, a very specific one of, the colonies to the motherland. If you are an Anglo-Australian, whereas America sort of feels more like an unrelated sort of superpower, maybe. But yeah, I'm not really answering that very well because I don't know if I necessarily have the expertise to make a grand statement about the shift. But it's something I will definitely think more about. It's really interesting question.
It's a big question, it is. I think one of the biggest changes I found has been in the sense of humor and what we see.
Oh, yeah, that's a really
sense of humor has kind of changed. Alan says, thank you, Emily, for sharing your thoughts. Are you interested in writing a screenplay at all for Wild Abandon or anything else?
That's also a good question. I did have a conversation about that with my agent recently, and I'm kind of in two minds. Like, The Strays has been optioned for a TV series, and I decided not to be involved in the writing process with that. And I sort of potentially had the option to become involved with writing something for Wild Abandon, a screenplay, but I don't know. I think I'm probably more focused on moving forward towards the next project. I think, you know, when I'm working on something, I get very, very obsessively involved in it, and I struggle to kind of multitask. And I think I probably wouldn't start writing another novel if I was working on the screenplay for this one. I think it would be a really fascinating experience, and I would love to kind of get those skills of screenwriting. But I think just staying with this story would feel like it was going to stop me from moving on to another creative project.
Especially as you were saying, correct me if I'm wrong, that you started writing it back in the Obama administration.
Yeah, it's been there for a long time already.
Yeah. Lucy says, Emily, your writing is so beautiful. Are you your own worst critic? How many drafts do you go through to produce such pitch perfect work?
Oh, thank you, Lucy. I do go through a lot of drafts, but I think, you know, again, I've probably sort of talked about this a lot with students who kind of face the same issue. What I've kind of discovered as a way of trying to get around the you know, that tendency to be my own worst critic is to try and divide the process into two parts. So the first draft, I try and kind of bring in as much of a sense of kind of play and, you know, exploration and curiosity, and just try and really compartmentalize and put that sort of inner editor to the side during that process. And I think part of how I do that is I write by hand in a notebook in pencil. Somehow that makes it feel less kind of permanent. And I do a lot of just kind of writing little bits and then doing arrows and writing extra bits, and it just feels messy and kind of not that serious. And then I kind of type up that first version into a Word document, and from that point there, I do kind of let the inner editor go and just do draft after draft. But I think, you know, from experience that it's not helpful to bring that inner editor into the first, you know, very first draft process. So that's how I try and get around it.
Yeah. Kevin says, do you have any models for the literary fireworks and thrilling wordiness of your novel? And or is this a voice that you've always written in and have always wanted to write in?
Thank you, Kevin. That's very lovely. Yeah, lots of kind of, I guess that some of the sort of big names of American literature, I feel like Krissy mentioned Cormac McCarthy. Don DeLillo was a big influence. Even Faulkner, although that might kind of seem weird reading this because it's, you know, very different, but I think that model of sort of the prose mirroring that sense of kind of excess and you know, hyper saturation and almost too muchness, I think comes through a little bit in some of those American writers who were also writing, you know, about those very, very kind of excessive worlds in various ways. So they would probably be my my big inspiration. Saul Bellow as well. And I did sort of really saturate my reading with those big American male writers as well, quite deliberately, when I was starting to write this, to kind of get a grounding in that tradition. And I already sort of loved all of those writers as well.
We've got a question from Jackie, and they say, thanks for your wonderful discussion. How do you feel about how prizes like you've received, in brackets, which is so great, will shape your writing practice in the future? For example, do you think prizes shape the way you will write in the future?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think definitely From my experience, it's only been a really amazing and incredibly helpful thing to have received the Stella Prize in particular. It did a huge amount of benefit for the sales of Strays. It gave me money that I could use to actually kind of write rather than working all the time, although I was still working all the time, but that's because I was silly enough to open a bar. I think there was definitely a sense of kind of pressure probably from winning the prize, but yeah, can't really complain about that. It was I just felt so fortunate. But in terms of like how they would actually impact my writing on a stylistic level or anything like that, I don't think so. They just really give a huge boost in terms of publicity and sales and the ability to actually spend your time writing rather than working.
Yeah, it would be so hard as well to tailor your writing to a prize because the judges change and they look for new stuff every year.
Absolutely. And I've been on the judging panel of a few things now, and I know how it works and how absolutely random it can be in the end. It's kind of just the combination of people that you have on the panel, and yeah.
Bianca says firstly she recently attended your workshop at the Queensland Writers Centre and she said it was amazing. She says, do you think writers need to market ourselves and our writing differently if we're writing across centuries?
Sorry, you may not be able to answer this, Bianca, but do you mean like spanning centuries or writing from now, but writing historical fiction?
Maybe, Bianca, come back to us in the comments and then I'll circle back to your question. In the meantime, we have a question from Marae. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. And they say, could you talk a little about the idea of wildness and the different ways it works for humans and animals in the work or even shaping the work?
Great question. Yeah, wildness was something that sort of, I guess, emerged as I went along as a really central theme, but one that I hadn't kind of thought as much about early in the process. I have always been really, really fascinated by animals. And I think, the more I thought about this, what would possess someone to want to collect wild animals, to kind of own, 56 tigers and lions and bears, the more I sort of started thinking about this idea of the kind of very idea of wildness as something that humans kind of long for, and potentially sort of more and more as we, destroy much of the kind of wild landscape of the planet and the habitat of these animals, and as they become rarer and rarer. And I think as our, lives become more and more sort of quote unquote civilized, there's something sort of undeniable that longs for contact with wildness, whether that's in the form of animals or, risk taking in various forms that kind of give you a sense of sort of living at the peak of your potential. There's a point where Will sort of has this strange sort of flight of fantasy about what drives people to climb mountains, and I think that's another thing. There's something that in us that wants not for any particular sort of reason, but for its own sake, an experience of contact with wildness. And so yeah, that became a real thread through the whole book. Wayne is definitely someone who has sought that in every sort of possible way. He went to war when he was very young. He's, a kind of risk taker. He collects motorbikes and guns and wild animals. I think I also sort of thought a lot about the way that, you know, men are encouraged to sort of associate themselves with the idea of wildness. And again, it kind of ties in with that tiny little thing that Krissy mentioned about the wolf sanctuary, which was a real thing I read about, where you know, combat veterans with PTSD went and spent time in this wolf sanctuary and were encouraged to kind of develop a one-on-one relationship with a wolf. And it's seen as sort of this healing thing, you know, a kind of panacea for the soul, that contact with the wild. But, you know, again, there's also that sort of critical element in my mind of what does this kind of mean for the wild itself, in whatever form, whether it's animals or landscape, that it's, you know, represents this commodity as well for humans, that, you know, we sort of are we valuing it for what it gives us or for its own sake? You know, there's a lot of kind of little pockets of wild landscape left in the world that it would probably be better if they were kind of locked off from humans entirely, and yet, you know, we kind of want to have access in our thousands and traipse through these environments and sort of destroy them. So, you know, I'm not really making a sort of particular point here, but all of those thoughts were just swirling around in my mind as I wrote this book.
I just want to quickly circle back to Bianca's question. So when she was talking about writers needing to market yourselves differently when writing across centuries, she means writing two different books, so going from a historical fiction and contemporary.
Yes.
So her first manuscript is historical fiction and her second is contemporary. So do you think writers need to market ourselves and our writing differently if we're writing across those different centuries?
Yeah, I mean, that was something I was a bit nervous about, to be honest, writing this book after The Strays, because I did sort of think potentially I could lose readers who wanted me to maybe stick with the historical fiction. But it hasn't, in, you know, my experience so far, been the case. And I think I've kind of left the marketing part of it up to my publisher. But yeah, the publishers didn't seem to kind of have as much of an issue or a concern with that change in direction as I thought they might. So that was really positive, I guess. You know, there's kind of room to for writers to jump around and potentially sort of tap into new markets and new audiences. It's an exciting thing to be able to do, to have that freedom.
We will end on a quick question from Kevin. He says, optional cheeky question from a Melburnian. Have you had a tip off from the Vic government about when you can reopen the bar?
I think the 5th of November is my understanding.
There you go. You heard it here first, Kevin. That's all we have time for tonight. Krissy, do you have any finishing words?
No, I just really, really hope that not only the bar can be open, but our touring events program can be open and we can get to grab you and drag you up to Queensland, because we really, really wanted to have this in real life. And it's such a shame to do it this way, because we can't go and have dinner afterwards, which is what we would be doing in normal circumstances. But it's been wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me. Avid Reader is just so dear to my heart. I spent many hours browsing the shelves when I lived in Brisbane, so look forward to coming back.
Fabulous.
Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank
This
you.
has been amazing. Thank you everyone for joining us in the crowd. And you can purchase Wild Abandon at Avid Reader or from your local lockdown bookstore. Thanks everyone.
Thanks.